Now let's hear viewpoints from both sides of the aisle. Austin Barbour is out this week, so we welcome Jim Perry to our red microphone. Jim is a former policy director for Governor Haley Barbour. And behind the blue microphone, as always, is Brandon Jones. Brandon is an attorney and a former Democratic member of the Mississippi House. Gentlemen, welcome to At Issue.
Be here. Welcome, Jim.
Thank you.
Let's start with these two tax plans. Brandon, you're kind of on the outside looking in. They're both Republican plans, one from the House, one from the Senate. Do you like one over the other?
No, I don't like the whole debate. I would like to just flip over the table. I mean, I feel like there was some concession this week by Senate that, we don't want to go too deep and that we require on these funds for some essential services within our state, not least of which is roads and bridges. And so I appreciate some of that circumspection and a little bit of that, slowing down the process. But I feel like I'm watching this debate over an insistence that we have to cut something off. We have to cut our left arm off, or we have to cut our right arm off, or we have to cut off, our legs too. And I feel like saying you really don't. I mean, you really don't have to do any of these procedures. We are a state that has historically had a difficult time paying our bills. We have a glut of federal money in reserve right now, but that's one-time money that's not coming back. We're underwater in terms of tax revenue this year. So there are already indicators that suggest that our economy is not growing at the moment. And so you would hate to do this, not be able to get it back. Because I don't think I'm saying anything controversial here to say that once you put tax cuts into effect, it's pretty tough to raise them back up. And I think we'd put our state in a tough spot. So to answer your question, Wilson, no, it's a little bit better in terms of not as deep a cut. But nonetheless, I don't think we need any cut at all at this moment.
Jim?
The last several years, the legislature and governor have actually cut taxes quite a bit. Income tax reductions, franchise tax, inventory tax. I think in particular the franchise tax and inventory tax changes have been very good for small businesses across the state, and they need to be done. And revenues have continued to go up. Certainly, as Brandon mentions, that has been impacted by federal injection of money into the economy, and how distortive that has been is something that I think that members of the legislature and the governor are very smart to pay attention to. I think that this broader tax debate of how much to cut income taxes and how fast and what to do with the grocery tax. And I think it is interesting that both bodies and their plans have thought about additional spending for roads and bridges and other infrastructure. There's been a lot of focus on that in the last several years. They take a slightly different tact on it in terms of whether or not it should be more of an excise tax or a sales tax, but it's interesting. I mean, that's a significant change than over the last 20 years. I mean, Commissioner Dick Hall spent decades saying that we needed to increase fuel taxes for roads, and now you have both chambers effectively saying that should happen.
And both controlled by the Republican Party saying, let's raise that tax.
So I'm told, yes, both are controlled by the Republican Party saying let's and it's a different type of approach. I just think it's interesting. I think that one thing that struck me about both of the plans is how deep and well thought they were. You can disagree with certain aspects of it, and if I was king of the world, I might come up with a different tax plan than either one of them. But I mean, I think they're both really well researched and thought out, and it clearly was not come up with on a napkin the night before they submitted it. And I think they should be applauded for that. I mean, they're not just reducing taxes across the board. They're willing to take some guff for increasing some things. I think the House plan for it really fundamentally changes how local governments are going to go about funding themselves. For years, there was significant opposition for some good reason against increasing sales taxes at the local level. And the House plan, in fact, relies significantly on that to make the numbers work. I'm less taken with what the details are on each of them. I think that generally they both want to both of them want to decrease taxes net. I think the debate is by how much and at what speed. I think it's more interesting how the approach to taxation is different. There's a definite, on the House side, more of a bias towards consumption taxes versus income taxes. And on the Senate side, we're a little bit worried about where the budget's going to be. And it's really no different than the tension that's been in the Republican Party for decades over are you more focused on the overall budget or the type of taxation? I'm not sure there's a right or wrong answer. I just think it's an interesting debate.
A lot more work to be done as the two sides of the Capitol come to some agreement on how to proceed. So we'll be watching that one. Early voting, a bill passed the Senate. It now moves on. And it has highlighted some differences within the Republican Party. Brandon, as a Democrat, how have you been observing that process?
Well, I want to. It may not be entirely helpful for me to do this, but I think that Senator Jeremy England gets some credit for how he's tried to navigate this situation. You know, Jim's old boss, Haley Barbour, years ago stepped out as a proponent of early voting, and we did a statewide tour with now Lieutenant Governor Hosemann leading it, then Secretary of State Hosemann, and we found overwhelming support for the concept of early voting throughout the state. And this wasn't from one political side or the other. It's really the way that modern voting works throughout most of the country. And what it does, you know, we don't have a holiday for voting, so people don't get off work to vote. We have one of the most restrictive absentee ballot processes in the entire country. What this does is acknowledge that we want as many people lawfully participating in the system as possible, and by expanding the time when they can participate, we get better numbers. I mean, Mississippi's voter turnout is abysmal. It's abysmal by almost any way you cut it. And as someone who works on campaigns, I can't help but point out we're still in the 30s, y'all. We're still in about 30% participation. Not only that, look at how we do our elections. This year, we're voting on municipal candidates. Guess when we do that? First week of June, during a year when nothing else is on the ballot. We do our statewide offices in off years. So there's a lot of intentionality in Mississippi around almost ensuring that Mississippians don't participate in the vote. So I'm kind of pleased that we have a bipartisan response that's saying, why don't we bring this into the modern world? The first time that I heard about this issue recently, the first time since Governor Barbour and Secretary Hosemann looked at it, was Bill Denny. Bill Denny, longtime chairman of elections over in the House, he had an early voting bill that, by my understanding, is very close to the one being offered by Senator England. No one would ever accuse Bill Denny, who sat behind me for 4 years in the House, of being a liberal. This is a guy who flew planes in Korea and who was about as rock-ribbed Republican as anybody you're going to find. But he saw the value in early voting after studying Mississippi's voting scheme for many decades. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is we need to think of this not as a partisan situation. We need to think of it as an answer to the fact that we have a woefully low percentage of people participating in our races. We need to think about it from the standpoint of having a state that has, relatively secure elections, that we don't need to be concerned about that. There's no reason to believe that our election apparatus can't handle what so many other states have been able to incorporate, and just to have more people be a part of the process. The last thing I'll say, think about military people and the difficulty that they have had. We've had some generals in our state weigh in on this issue this week. This voting is a nightmare if you serve active duty in the military, for them and for their families. Also, have you talked to a college student in the last couple years about what it's like to participate in a Mississippi election as a college student in another state? It's unbelievable. So the absentee voting system that we have in place, you don't think is adequate to accommodate those people? It's not. What you have to do at this moment, and I don't want to belabor this, but when we say that Mississippi has one of the most restrictive, the only way that you can vote absentee in Mississippi is if you fit into a very narrow category of things. One of them is that you work outside of the county. One of them is that you have a disability. Military duty is another one. There are a few other factors. You have to send in an application. that application has to be notarized. That application is received. If everything's in order, if you signed in all the right spots, if every jot and tittle is in place, your clerk will send you a ballot. That ballot has to be completed, signed in the right spot, signed across the envelope flap, filled out properly with your address, which has to match up. There's other considerations around the new voter ID requirement. That, too, has to be notarized.
Not anymore.
Is that the notarization's out on the second one?
You don't have to get it notarized on the second one. You have to have a witness.
Okay, yeah. So a witness requirement. So there's no state in America that requires that type of scheme in order to participate early.
Too many hoops, you're saying.
Too many hoops. And look, it shows up in our numbers. You don't have to look any farther than the statistics. We just do not have folks participating in Mississippi elections. And I think the folks who are winning Mississippi elections want it that way. So if I were Governor Reeves, maybe I'd be yelling too, because he just won a very close race with a pretty low turnout. But if you want people in Mississippi to participate, we need to change our system to make sure we're doing all the things that modern states are doing to allow that participation.
So, Jim, do we leave it alone, or do we pass some form of early voting?
Well, I'll quibble with a couple of the assumptions that Brandon made there. I don't think that our turnout, when you have competitive elections, I don't think our turnout is that much different than other places. In a competitive Senate race and a competitive governor's race, you're going to see a higher turnout. In a presidential election, even this year, where I don't think there was much question how Mississippi was going to vote, our turnout in the presidential election was fairly robust. I'm not sure what problem it is that we're trying to solve with early voting. I think there's a lot of changes that should be done to election laws in Mississippi and campaign finance laws. I find it astounding that you can have a mayor of our largest city in the state not file a campaign finance report for several years, theoretically be against the law to run again if you don't do that sort of thing. Then when he does file it, it turns out that every expense he had rounded exactly to the dollar and didn't add up, and it was clearly seriously flawed. I think that there's a lot of attention that should be paid to the campaign finance system. I think is anybody that's worked a poll in an election, we put an awful lot of stress on people who are working 12-plus hour days and making less than $100 to be a poll worker, and it's getting harder and harder to get those poll workers. I think there's a lot of attention that should be done there. I think ensuring that election commissions can be bipartisan, I think would be very good. So there's a lot of things that should be done on the election code, and I think that Jeremy England and Lieutenant Governor Hoseman and others in the legislature have been working on a lot of those things. I think it's great. On early voting, look, everybody is for early voting to some degree. It's a matter of degree. If you vote absentee, you're voting early. And in Mississippi, like Brandon said, there's a lot of ways you can vote absentee. If you're over 65, you can vote early through the absentee ballot. My concern about early voting, no excuse early voting, is that it effectively is an incumbency protection act. When you were in Brandon's run campaigns, I've been involved in running campaigns, you're working back from election day on your advertising, on how you spend money, because you're trying to build up to the point where the conversation has been robust enough and the civic discourse has been robust enough that people are able to make an informed decision. Hopefully they make the decision to support the candidate you're working for. But if you have a multiple weeks of election days, that means you have to spend a whole lot more money in your campaigns. And the incumbent inevitably has a greater advantage going into that. They typically would have greater name ID than a challenger, and they're going to have an easier time raising money. And so what early voting allows typically is the most partisan, the most already convinced. Those are going to be the people that go vote early. The people that are maybe not as already convinced, I'd kind of like for them to get the full benefit of the entire general election campaign. It might be easier for a couple people here or there, although our rules and laws on absentee ballots are pretty lenient, frankly, in terms of who can vote. I don't know that it's necessarily good for democracy to create a general election season where we don't gear towards one day, but instead we gear towards multiple weeks. Some states it's as many as 50 days. And I just don't think that's good for democracy long term.
Let's talk about the ballot initiative. It is dead again, so it's not likely to happen this legislative session where the voters will once again have a way to essentially change laws or perhaps change the Constitution through the voting process. Brandon, are you discouraged by that, or did it not surprise you?
No, I would like us to restore the same process that we had before the Supreme Court took it away. I think ballot initiatives serve their place, and certainly in Mississippi, they are hard enough to pass, and our track record in this space proves not everything that gets on the ballot passes. It's a tough hill to climb, and I think if we do reinstitute it, it'll be slightly harder than it was before, if we were even to go back that way. What the House offered was really not something that I think excited anyone. When they passed it out of committee, I scratched my head because I thought, who is telling you they're interested in this? These things cost millions of dollars. You have to spend a ton of time getting the right signatures in place, and I don't know of any individual or organization that's going to do any of that for something that the legislature can take away almost as soon as it's instituted. So, I didn't really understand what the exercise was there. The Senate sent the message over to the House that they didn't have any interest in working with that bill, and so we moved to another year. It's better to do nothing than to do something that's wrong-headed. So no problem for me on that. Yeah, I'd love to see us reinstitute something. That constitutional right's important, especially in a state like ours where, really in any state, your legislature can be obstinate around some things. And frankly, if you talk to some legislators from around the country, they'll tell you, look, this can be kind of helpful because there are some things that we just simply can't do within our body. The politics don't line up. The internal partisan politics are kind of janky on this, so we kind of need the public's health here. Medical marijuana is a perfect example of this. Republicans didn't know how to untangle themselves on that. They kind of needed a shove. And what they found out was that over 70% of Mississippi voters were in favor of it. Sometimes you need that. Medicaid expansion is another thing. Overwhelmingly popular. The guys over there in the Capitol building can't find their way into it. Those types of things are what you have ballot initiatives for, so that when there's something that's overwhelmingly important to the public, they have another means of getting it through rather than waiting on an obstinate chairman who just can't find his way into bringing up an issue he doesn't understand. I'll mention also the state flag. Not a bad opportunity to use your ballot initiative. Now, that piece, the legislative-driven ballot initiative process still works. But, being able to put something on there as a citizen, recognizing the number of votes you have to get, the number of signatures you have to get it on the ballot, and then the fact that you have to get sort of a super majority in order to pass it, I feel like that's a good thing, something that Mississippi could use, and I think most people tend to agree with that.
How about you, Jim? Do you agree with that? Do you think Mississippi needs a ballot initiative process?
I think that polls would show that Mississippians generally would like to have a ballot initiative. I think that one of the reasons why it hasn't gone through the legislature since the Supreme Court overturned the ballot initiative process that existed before is that there has been an intervening election of legislators, and nobody really lost on this issue. I think people want it, but they don't feel that strongly about it. And Brandon mentioned the marijuana constitutional amendment. I think that's actually a good example about why we need to be very, very cautious about this. There was that constitutional amendment which passed at the ballot box had essentially multiple pages of statutory language in it about a very complex issue that, frankly, since it's been on the ballot, we've been getting more and more science and data and information about a lot of the real harms and worries that we should have on how the marijuana program works. And we're learning more and more about information from other states. And it was interesting to me that when the legislature started taking up that issue after the constitutional process was thrown out, the advocates for that constitutional amendment stood up in hearings and said, we put some things we probably ought to change in this language because it doesn't really work the way that we wanted it to. And I thought to myself as I sat there in the hearing room, well, I'm glad it's not in the Constitution because we wouldn't be able to fix it. And
without the public voting on it again.
On it again. And I think that there's constitutions are best for systems of government, the structure of government, the rights, and not about whether or not we should be selling liquor in a grocery store. I mean, some things are just better left for the legislative process. And it's hard, and it's messy, and it's supposed to be hard, and it's supposed to be messy to make sure we get there the right way. And if you look at California, where they have so many things that have been put on the ballot and put in the Constitution, that it's made it really hard for them to govern themselves. And I think that Brandon's right. I think it's popular. I think that something eventually will happen. Something probably should happen at some point. I just think we got to be really cautious that we don't just turn statutory language into constitutional rights that get there because who was able to spend the most money on a campaign and hire the best political consultants like Brandon.
Well, what about a ballot?
Nice plug.
What about a ballot initiative process that doesn't change the Constitution, but that changed state statute, like the measure that died?
I think
session?
that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of legislators have moved in that direction. Something will happen at some point. I just don't know that it's at the end of the day. What we're talking about here is process as opposed to policy. I think what is going to animate voters to get really aggravated over it is if there is a particular policy initiative that they really want the legislature to address and it takes several years and it doesn't happen, then I think you're going to start seeing a more aggressive tone from voters about demanding a more specific ballot initiative process. I think people get animated about issues more so than they do about process.
Like we saw with medical marijuana.
I think that clearly was an example that there was. Now I don't know that it was. I don't know that the marijuana initiative was something that was being talked about at every coffee shop. I do think it was being talked about by some very wealthy entities that wanted it to be done, and they were able to animate support for their cause.
Gentlemen, it's been good talking with both of you. We always enjoy that. And Jim Perry, it's good to have you with us in Austin's place this week. Austin, of course, will be back, but we thank you both for spending some time with us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Brandon, was there anything else you wanted to jump in there and say?
No, I mean, I was struck by, good argument from Jim about the ballot initiative and whether or not we want all this in the Constitution. I guess the only thing I'd say about that is we would trade for California's economy in like 2 seconds.
Of course we would.
So I don't know that California is like
but there's
really
also
a great example of like awfulness. But
I think that the California. Are we still rolling? By the way,
we are. We'll see what happens.
I think that the California is not Mississippi. I mean, it's a fifth of the U.S. economy. But I think that they're governing their budget process is challenging, to say the least, in terms of how revenues boom and bust, and I think that the initiative process complicates things for them.
No, it's a serious point, and I guess what I would say, I'm just thinking about that from a Mississippi perspective, and I can't help but think, look, we are still laboring under an 1890 Constitution, and if you read the commentary on that Constitution, it was developed to prohibit black men from holding property and from voting. Now, we've amended it over time, but I think sometimes we can be a little bit too precious about these things. Like, yes, don't get me wrong, Constitution, serious things. The way that rights are allocated under a Constitution, serious things. And to your point, it's harder to change things when they're implemented in that way. But I guess I just don't share that sort of caution in instances where there's that type of support to institute something into law. The legislature still has all the levers that it would otherwise have. It can put something up for an amendment. It can still pass whatever statutory authority still remains. But I hear that. I mean, I think it's better to look at a ballot initiative as a last resort. This is where you go when you've not been able to convince the legislature to do something. And that's why some of those instances that we think about in Mississippi's recent history, it's like, heck, what else were you going to do? We probably still, let's be honest, we probably still wouldn't have medical marijuana in Mississippi if it was left up to the legislature.
I think that I do not want my hesitancy or concerns about the ballot initiative process about where it could go to in any way, shape, or form be viewed as me defending the 1890 Constitution.
Fair play.
I think that your point about it being a last resort is a very good one. I mean, I'm not offended by the concept of a ballot initiative process. I think
it's good to have somebody in here who's not as delicate as Austin. That's good. You're not easily offended. Finally,
I think that there's reasons why people want it. I mean, they see recalcitrant legislators, and it's hard theoretically. The answer to that is you vote them out the next time at the ballot box, right? I think that where you find that line of it being a last resort as opposed to a first resort, where we're not just we have a republic and not a pure democracy for a reason. And I think that the founding fathers were right to shift to a representative democracy, a republic, as opposed to a let's throw everything up for what happens in the ballot box, especially when it turns into multi-page statutes that get summed up in 3 sentences on a ballot that when people go to the ballot box and it's like, oh, that sounds like a good idea, and it hasn't really been properly vetted. I think that's the tension, and I think we'll figure it out. You just want to make sure it doesn't get to the point where it's abused and it's just what out-of-state interest can fund a campaign that overwhelms any sort of reasonable opposition.
It's somewhat unusual to be able to talk to somebody thoughtful in this setting. So if you'll indulge this, Jim, you're now. I'm just coming at Austin hard. This is good. It's all in good fun. But Jim, you served under the Barbour administration. Now, of course, you're in private sector. I'm curious. Do you miss any of this? Is there any part of it that you still wish you could get back in, back in that policy space, back in that governance space?
In our remaining 5 seconds, what do you say?
It's great. I think anybody who has had the opportunity to work for somebody like Governor Barbour, you yearn for those opportunities again. He was a very good leader, and I learned a lot from him, and got to work with a lot of very talented people in state government. And I'm on the State Board of Health, which is a nice way to serve, and I do enjoy it.
Well, Jim Perry, we thank you for your perspective today on At Issue. And Brandon, as always, we appreciate yours too. This has been At Issue, a weekly discussion about the 2025 Mississippi legislative session. You can hear At Issue every Friday night at 6:30 during the session on MPB Think Radio. You can also subscribe to our At Issue podcast, which features extended versions of our roundtable discussions and featured interviews. And if you'd really like to see what we all look like, you can catch the video versions of our roundtable and interviews at mpbonline.org and on YouTube. At Issue is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting. I'm Wilson Stribling. From all of us at MPB, we thank you for joining us.